how do you respond to people who excel you in accomplishment, creativity, invention, wealth creation? Do you think that the successes of others somehow diminish you? Do you think that the world is essentially a zero-sum game? That any gains for one person or for the wealth of human beings come at the expense of other people or at the cost of the environment? Or do you believe that the successes of others enlarge your possibilities? Do you admire and emulate the successes of others? Do you believe that the world is a positive sum game where wealth creation causes spirals of opportunity and possibility for the world? I believe this sums up an Israel test. Because today in the world, Israel distills and concentrates the genius of the Jews. And the entire 20th century really revolved around the enormous achievements and inventions and insights and accomplishments of Jewish people. And the countries that were aligned with the Jews, the countries that passed their Israel test, prospered. And all the countries that ejected their Jews or suppressed their Jews ended up pretty much in the dustbins of history. And I believe today this issue revolves around the state of Israel, and that it cleaves every human heart, and it divides the world economy and the global society into two fractious armies. And it really divides barbarism on one side from civilization on the other. And I began and first became conscious of this pivotal role of Jews in history through the study of quantum physics. I wrote a book called Microcosm, The Quantum Age in Economics and Technology. And it became evident that much of the science of the 20th century originated with Jews. There have been Einstein and Bohr and von Neumann and Pauli and many of the great figures of 20th century science were Jews. And it seems to me that the critical event, one of the critical events of the 20th century, was the departure of these Jews from Europe and their arrival in the United States before the Second World War. And then their gathering in Los Alamos and Chicago and other places across the country to accomplish the Manhattan Project, which produced the first atomic bomb. And really won the Cold War, won the Hot War, won the Second World War for the West, and then made possible our triumph in the Cold War afterwards. And this was really dominantly an accomplishment of Jews. The Manhattan Project could not have succeeded without Oppenheimer and Einstein and von Neumann and Fermi, who had a Jewish wife and was driven from Europe with Jews, and Wigner and Szilard, and these people were absolutely pivotal to the American success in the Second World War and ability to thwart communism in the era after the Second World War. And the countries that expelled Jews ended up on the other side of this picture in totalitarian pits of degradation and squalor and sterility. And that's really was the first American triumph in the Israel test. And I believe today, after writing about the successes of Jewish science during the Second World War, I began writing about technology. And I've written probably 7 or 8 books about technology. I invest in companies around the world and have come to be known as a futuristic expert on technology. But in writing Microcosm, in which the central company that I focused on was Intel Corporation, I was really unaware and that Intel Corporation, which is the most important technological asset of the United States corporately, Intel was the company that invented the key initial microchips on which was founded the information age in America, and from which derived our military capabilities, which are based chiefly on American mastery of microchips and software and semiconductor technology. But in the last few years, I've discovered that Intel Corporation has a secret life. Intel stamps on computers around the globe, Intel inside. But all Intel's chips might well be stamped Israel inside, because all the major breakthroughs of Intel Corporation, the most important American microchip company and pivotal in the entire information age, were mostly designed in Israel. The 8088 microprocessor, for example, which is the microprocessor in the first IBM personal computer, was designed at a center in Haifa that was started by Dov Froman, who also invented the non-volatile memory, semiconductor memory, that we now know as the flash memory, but then it was the EEPROM, and it has evolved over the years to make possible all the solid state drives. You see the thumb drives, the iPods and Nanos, and now iPads and thumb drives, all these devices which are all based on the non-volatile memory technology that was invented by Dov Froman, an Israeli who came to Intel early in his career and accounted for some 80% of all Intel's profits during its first 10 years. And then he moved to Israel and started the design center that ultimately produced the 8088, the 8087, which made possible the personal computer to be used in business applications. That's a math coprocessor. And then a whole series of later chips from Intel were made in Israel as well, or designed in Israel. Climaxed by the Core i7, which if you watched the Super Bowl this year, you saw Intel describing its new and allegedly most important microprocessor ever, was the Core i7, which had 4 cores, 4 separate paths for processing on a single chip. And the Core i7 is known as Nahalem, which is the Hebrew word for streams, and it conveys the multiple streams of processing that are possible. Now the Core i7 7 has been translated into Gulf Town, as it's called, the new Intel processor with 6 cores, which is really the Core i7 distilled to get a smaller chip with smaller transistors and lower power. And this processor will influence the whole future development of microchips. So, and I focus on Intel, and I could talk about Israel's impact on Intel further, but I could have told a story about Microsoft, which also is heavily dependent on its Israel design centers. President Palmer of Microsoft recently said that Microsoft is really heavily an Israeli company, and indeed, the most successful Intel product, Microsoft product for the last decade or so is its new Windows 7 operating system, and all the user interface advances which have made it so popular and successful came from the Israel Design Center of Microsoft. And all this was sort of amusingly reflected in my Facebook page for the Israel test, because I was told by a leading venture capitalist in Israel that I had to have a Facebook page for my book because this was really important. So I got a Facebook page for the Israel test, and now I have about 2,400 fans on Facebook. And this was very exciting to me. And I looked at the sources of these fans, and I have 15 fans in New York, and several in Chicago, they're probably all here, and 1,500 fans in Petah Tikva. And Petah Tikva is a town in Israel that I never heard of. And I investigated and found out that Petah Tikva is the site of Intel's Israel headquarters, and IBM's Israel headquarters, and Microsoft Israel headquarters, and Teva, which is the big Israeli pharmaceutical company, and a whole array of key companies are in Petah Tikva. So Facebook may not be a tremendously effective way to sell books, but it does show where your real target is. I mean, these people are the people who are most celebrated in the pages of the Israel test. And it's not just the accomplishments in semiconductor technology. Semiconductor technology is particularly important. This is microchips because it has deep military implications, and without microchip technology, there's most of America's leading defense programs would be ineffectual. I mean, and much of the semiconductor technology in our drones and Predators and other key equipment employed in the Middle East and crucial to our defense, including anti-missile technology, have vital contributions from Israel. There's some 600 advances, for example, that originate in Israel for the F-16 fighter jet. And Israel is just central to the American defense. And it's often said that Israel is somehow dependent of the United States, or that we should support Israel out of charity, or we should support Israel out of democratic idealism, or we should support Israel because it has gay rights and a strong court system. But we should support Israel because Israel massively supports us.
That's right.
And indeed, I believe that one of the problems with American foreign policy today is that it is confused and undermined by our failure to focus on the critical asset in the Middle East that we have to defend, which is Israel. Because we don't want to declare that this is a real focus of our engagement over there, people make charges that we're only in it for the oil, or that and that oil is more important than the genius of Israel. I mean, that's the implication of a stress not on the real focus that would lend our foreign and military policies coherence and purpose and strategic unity. Instead, we end up trying to balance one Arab tribe against another, Shiites against Sunnis, against Pashtuns, and try to create democratic regimes in countries deeply resistant to them, at least countries that have whatever their deep democratic aspirations may ultimately be, cannot be responsive to American power. So we make these kind of open-ended commitments in the Middle East to these sort of nebulous goals like democracy, when there's one democracy in one critical country which is critical to the future of the U.S. economy and our defense. And if we just declared that we're defending this country, and that's why we got these troops in the Middle East, it would make our policy much more believable and our strength more obvious, and our alliance more clearly redemptive. So, and this, a lot of people look at Israel as somehow beleaguered and somehow vulnerable and ultimately likely to fail. And this too is a real misconception. Israel gets stronger every minute, and its power today is greater than it's ever been in relation to all its neighbors. Its contribution to the United States is greater than it's ever been in relation to other allies we have. And Deloitte and Touche made an analysis of venture capitalists around the world. It surveyed venture capitalists in all countries and asked the question of which country had the most technological leadership in a variety of fields, including microchips, telecoms, software, biotech, clean tech. I've left one out, but there's 6 key fields which pretty much cover the span of major venture capital activities. And venture capital is absolutely the seminal investment function in every economy. And in the United States, it accounts for close to 20% of GDP directly, and about 1/3 of private sector GDP, and even a greater proportion of productivity gains and other advances. And these 400 venture capitalists around the world, some 400 who were interviewed by Deloitte and Touche, ranked Israel second only to the United States in absolute terms. In per capita terms, Israel was just vastly ahead of every other country in venture capital technology, in technology supported by venture capital. But in absolute terms, it was second only to the United States. And today, when I look for opportunities in the world as an investor, I never even thought of Israel until 3 or 4 years ago, but now I discover that it is really more vibrant than Silicon Valley itself today. Silicon Valley in California, unfortunately, is deeply embroiled in green technology that has very little promise, and its venture capitalists are dominated by climate cranks and weather wars, and as a result, these are venture capitalists who are seeking subsidies rather than generating new profits that can produce revenues for the government. It's angling to get its share of government revenues. It's becoming a consumer of taxes rather than a generator of new tax revenues. And that is, meanwhile, the Silicon Wada, as they call it in Israel, is moving from triumph to triumph and is really the spearhead of global technology. But this comes at no cost to the United States. It's, every one of those advances in Israel is almost immediately transmitted to the United States. Every one of these Israeli startups has a link to some American startup or some large American company. And so just as Intel Corporation became the dominant company in the world economy for many years, and the most profitable chip company in the world, and one of the most valuable technology companies anywhere, all based on its Israeli contributions. So all these other Israeli breakthroughs, from new ultra-wideband technology that can see through walls and identify people with guns behind walls, and there's a company called Camaro, and just these Israeli startups are all linked to the United States, and we immediately benefit from them. It's an invention in Israel may get manifested in the U.S. economy even quicker than a lot of inventions in the United States, because the United States really does suffer from a lot of restrictive litigation and environmental regulation that makes it harder to bring forth new inventions than it was in the past. So the U.S. is a vast beneficiary of Israel. But important in political terms is to understand that the biggest beneficiary from Israel's breakthroughs and advances have been the Palestinian Arabs. Many people imagine that the Palestinian Arabs are somehow victims of Israel, and it's just a bizarre idea, but all the universities of America teach it. It's one of the general dementias that have taken over American campuses. And I like, when I write a book, I like to understand the views of my opponents better than they do. So I have in my house just these piles and piles of Palestinian grievance tomes. And it's incredible, to the iron cage, the iron wall, the iron hammer, the iron this and the iron that supposedly represses the Palestinians. It displaced the Palestinians and exploited the Palestinians. But when I actually started studying this subject a couple years ago, I went to the actual numbers and looked between there were no Israelis in the territories in Judea and Samaria and Gaza before 1967. They'd all been driven out. And so, but after 1967, after the 1967 war, the some 250,000 Israeli settlers moved into these territories. And these 250,000 Israeli settlers, these are the vicious settlers who supposedly pose an impossible problem for peace. And these settlers, Israeli settlers, made all sorts of advances in the West Bank. This was a time when Israel itself was in the sloughs of socialism, and the West Bank was kind of a wild east for Israeli enterprise. And they built all sorts of irrigation facilities and 6 big new universities and some 22,000 new major factories. And the result, and power grid and hospitals, and the result of this were that the 250,000 Jewish settlers were joined by some 2 million Arabs moving into the territories. In other words, the Arab population of the territories tripled. So how can there be a lot of displacement of a population that's tripling in number? So, and were they exploited, these 2 million Arabs? Did they rush in to participate in the Israeli enterprise in the West Bank in order to be exploited and oppressed? No, their per capita incomes tripled during these 20 years. So not only did their numbers triple, but their per capita incomes tripled. And were they driven to the bone by their evil Israeli bosses? No, their life expectancies increased from about 40 years to 70 years. Just one of the most complete, transformations of the health conditions of a population ever was accomplished during this period. And people imagine that Arafat and the PLO had to be brought back from Tunisia to save these poor Palestinians who were being oppressed by the Israelis. That's not what happened at all. What happened was the Palestinians were too happy. They didn't really need Arafat anymore. He was feeling neglected. And although the demand for him in the West Bank was weak, there was big demand for him in one crucial arena, the UN. And the UN and the American peace movement all got Arafat, brought him back to Palestine, as it's called, and gave him some $4 billion of foreign aid, much of which was dispatched to Switzerland, and he started the Intifada, and the whole triumph of collaboration between Jews and Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza was brought to a screeching halt. And the economy contracted by some 40%, and this impossible problem was created by outsiders chiefly, and by foreign aid programs, and by refugee relief organizations, and all these outside meddlers from the left and from international organizations that fail their Israel test. They believe that the successes of Israel, the successes of America somehow must come at the expense of other people. And who could those people be? They must be the Palestinian Arabs, since there's this global movement to focus on them as the kind of canonical victims in the world economy. So that is, that's really the question. I mean, some people think Israel's too small. I think Israel's too small. I go to Washington, I get the contrary view, that the major problem of Israel, the major problem of the Middle East, is that tiny Israel has too much land. That's the problem. They got to give up land, which they got less of than almost any other country in the world, and for peace, when none of their supposed negotiators, the people they're negotiating with, want peace. And they all fail their Israel test. They imagine that if they capture Israel, they'll get all the wealth of Israel. But this never happens. The wealth of Israel is in people's minds and spirits, and there's zorizis, as I say in my book, which is the spirit of aspiration and willpower, which is behind all major accomplishment. And it's you know, when Castro took over the means of production in Cuba, he didn't get rich from these means of production because the men of production fled to Miami. And the real heart of the Cuban economy today and Cuban creativity, Cuban culture is not in that island 90 miles off the shore of the United States. It's in Miami. It's in Florida. And you know, this whole idea that somehow by giving land to the Palestinians you can make them a viable entity is just a complete delusion. I believe that Israel's too small and that the world has crammed Israel into a territory that's almost indefensible, and that the real Palestinian state exists. It's about 5 times bigger than Israel, and it's called Jordan. And that's a Palestinian country. The king of Jordan just has a Palestinian wife, but he doesn't really want the PLO in there. Nobody wants the PLO except the peace organizations and the UN. They're the only people who want the PLO. Even the Palestinians don't, although they get intimidated by these terrorists into their... I believe that it would be possible to create another golden age like the 20 years between 1967 and 1990 when the Palestinian Arabs had their last golden age in collaboration with Israel. So I think David Gilder of Yale, who's a great computer scientist, he was lost his hand to the Unabomber a few years back, but is also a great writer and artist, and he says that the problem in the Middle East will be solved as soon as the rest of the world stops trying to solve it. Luckily, Israel has a great leader now. Bibi Netanyahu is a great man and a great leader of the West, and if Obama was smart, he'd seek his guidance. Crisis. So we have an Israel test. I think Israel, I write about light, and I really got involved in Israel through my technology conference, which is called Telecosm. And I invited an Israeli entrepreneur, physicist named David Medved, who is the father of venture capitalist Jonathan Medved and Michael Medved, the radio writer and radio talk show Medved, and Discovery Institute fellow. And David Medved spoke about light, and he's a great inventor of technologies, of laser technologies, and he even spoke of using the light of ultraviolet light for communications, which is experiments in Israel are pursuing, to not yet to great success. But I think that Israel has been a master of the electromagnetic spectrum ever since early this century, when Henrik Hertz, not Israel, but Jews have been a master of the electromagnetic spectrum. Henrik Hertz sent the first radio waves across from Rome, and thus fulfilled Maxwell's view of the existence of such radiation. And then Albert Michelson did the first experiments that showed that the speed of light was not affected by the movement or rotation of the Earth. And since then, Israel has made steady contributions to the understanding of light, and Israel is indeed a light to Joseph Soloveitchik's statement. He's become a favorite writer of mine since I started studying the subject. In the Halakhic Mind, he writes that the white light of divinity is always refracted through reality's dome of many-colored glass. And I believe that the white light of divinity that shines in Israel is manifested around the world in many different colors, and in fact suffuses the U.S. economy and provides guidance for the future. Thank you so much.